I'm so excited to talk about some of the hard questions in the first vision. This is one of the most beautiful accounts in the world, and I'm thrilled to be able to dive down deep into the history, to step back into the 19th century, and to become part of the Second Great Awakening with you, and to feel as if there was a religious excitement around us so that we too can understand some of the hard questions that have been developed, that have grown out of Joseph's first vision. Initially, people were most upset. How dare you destroy the Trinity? Now, it's really interesting because there was a large movement at this time in the early 19th century to have everything in your religion consistent with the Bible. And the word Trinity is not there. And so even people as exacting on biblical interpretation as Alexander Campbell, who denounced the Trinity on all sides, still taught it. He didn't like the word, but the principle he still taught. So it's fascinating to see what things bothered them and why. Why do you trust a 14-year-old boy? Now, that probably offends some people more than it does others. But in the 19th century, you were legally old enough to be married at 14. You were also a common age for starting your careers, and it was a little different than it is now. But why was it not recorded until 1832? That is a question that I have heard many times, and sometimes is taken to the extreme of saying, obviously, it was an afterthought being added on. So we'll look at that question for sure. Why are the multiple accounts different? And I don't know how many of you have ever studied memory, but when I went through chemo and lost most of my memory, I studied a lot about memory and how does it stick and how does it change. And if you do not have an account that was written shortly after the event happened, you don't get the historical perspective on it, but you may not get an exactly accurate account either. I was writing a book one time and had to have about 20 family members share their stories. And I wrote them all out and I sent them to them and said, is this your story? Did I communicate it correctly? Not one of them said I communicated it correctly. All of them had me change little innuendos. My memory was not the same as theirs. And one of my daughters said, Mom, I wrote it in my journal. You can go read my journal. And I said, I read my journal. I went back and read my journal of this event. So sometimes the accounts are different because they're written at a different time and our memories have changed. And other times it's just a different perspective. When I look at history, I like thinking of it as a crystal, and different angles show different lights. And you have to walk around the crystal in order to appreciate on all sides of the way that it reflects light. And so as we look at the hard questions in history, in church history, why was it recorded until 1832? And what difference does that make between an 1832 account and 1834 and 1838? Well, the blessing of history does affect us as well. So that is one we'll be discussing. Why is there a lack of corroborating evidence? Now that was answered beautifully in one of my favorite books on the first vision, which is Opening the Windows of Heaven by John W. Welch and Eric Carlson. And I want to read to you what Jack said there. You know, when you're dealing with an attorney, he doesn't want to let any evidence slip away, and he doesn't want to have any chance of a word being wrong, because politically they know that every word has little innuendos. So this is really significant. He said, there is a high degree of independent, cumulative cooperation among the accounts. So whether or not we are seeing a word-for-word copy from one year to the next, or whether or not we're seeing interpretation in each account, I think is a better validation of its accuracy. And the last one, why didn't Joseph tell his parents? Well, as a mother, I think that is a very easy to answer question, because your children don't always tell you everything. And also, no matter how hard you try to love them, they sometimes need some independence. And I feel that that's part of it. But let's step back into America. 19th century, Second Great Awakening, First Great Awakening, First Constitutional Convention, first landing on Plymouth Rock. There was no religious freedom for a long time. And the thing that prepared the nation to make a decision in 1776 is because they learned to make decisions about their religious freedoms. But initially, I've read pages and pages and pages of the stories of people like Quakers coming into port in the early 1700s and even late 1600s, and they weren't even allowed to get off the boat to get clear water. They're just pushed right away. There was no freedom of religion initially, and that changed at the First Great Awakening. It began in the 1730s and lasted about 10 years. And the force, the momentum behind this came from this wonderful British preacher. He was an Anglican. His name was George Whitefield, but sometimes they call him Whitfield. And he came over from England at least 7 times. And he is the person that unified these 13 colonies theologically. Once their values were unified, to come to a new land and to establish property that you may not have been able to hold in the old world. But once they began to talk about God the same way and the same vocabulary, they became unified in a different way than just the values for independence. And I think it was this man's great work who unified the nation theologically before they could make a choice to become unified politically. Now, this painting, or this artist rendition, has his eyes sort of looking funny, and that is accurate. He was cross-eyed, and his critics would say, you can tell he's got a devil in him, he never looks straight. And his supporters defended him and said, no, his eyes are forming the cross. He carries Christ with him in everywhere he goes. And, so you get a lot of information on him. But as he came down and gave revivals or camp meetings all the way down the 13 colonies, there was an amazing religious excitement. In fact, even when you read things like Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, he talks about going to hear him. And, Ben was a deist. He's not necessarily a Christian. He believes in God, but the current understanding of Christ in the Bible was so different than what we believe that he denounced it. But our sweet Benjamin Franklin emptied out everything in his pockets to give to him because he was so charismatic and he felt so wonderful about the message that was given. This man was really, I believe, divinely inspired and part of our nation's early history. The Second Great Awakening started out in 1801 in Kentucky, in Cane Ridge, and lasted just about through 1840. Now, everyone will give you slightly different beginning and ending dates, but most people agree that in 1801, when this little town of Cane Ridge, Kentucky, gathered together to hear 3 or 4 ministers, Barton Stone was one of them, and I think he's my favorite. He spoke a lot on the Spirit. They had 25,000 gathered. And this is the nearest town had 2,000 at the time. This is the western frontier. And these tiny little towns of 200, 300, 400, you get 25,000 people there. It was just amazing. The nation at this time was less than 3 million people in total. And he gets 25,000 at this little religious gathering. And it just grew and grew. Actually, we'll talk about that more later. I keep forgetting. But the 3 topics of conversation that were the most regularly discussed during the time of the Second Great Awakening were number 3, depravity of man, number 2, the Trinity, and number 1, Revelation. This just blew me away when I learned this. But the more you read of divinity school writings and perhaps even the newspapers, the journal articles, the sermons from churches, I just couldn't agree more. The hot topics were Revelation, the depravity of man, and the Trinity. This is what was the most regularly spoken and written about. And people are attacking from all directions. And because they attack, other groups became even stronger in their diehard for the Trinity. And it's just fascinating. Another set of topics that were very regularly spoken of were the reality of God, the freedom of the will, infant baptism, universal salvation, and the need for reason. All of these are discussed in Joseph Smith's Restoration. It's as if the seeds had been planted and people were ripe for truth. I feel that many of the ministers who were preaching in that day were following promptings of the Lord. They were inspired, and they were speaking from what they learned in the Bible. And all of these topics became very socially appropriate. You know, we have a few things that are taboo. We don't talk about religion. We don't talk about politics. We don't talk about et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to use politically correct language when we're referring to different socioeconomic or different nationalities, which I think is good and proper and sensitive. But this time, the Second Great Awakening, this was the topic of conversation. Everybody's involved, not just this small little group. In fact, they started all the Ivy League colleges so that you could have divinity schools because we had such a need for religiously trained ministers. As more and more people are coming to the nation, they wanted to increase the number of ministers. And most of the Calvinist-based or the Reformed-based faiths required a minister to have a degree or a degree in theology or a thorough education in the area of religious studies. And so as the population is barely doubling, we get 3 times the capacity. Well, I'll keep going. I just wanted to show you where these divinity schools were. I'm getting ahead of my slides. But our Dartmouth was to teach the Indians the gospel. And you know their statement there in Latin, a voice crying in the wilderness from John the Baptist. And Harvard, In Search of Truth. And look at Yale down here. It's even in Hebrew, light and truth. They were all started as religious divinity colleges to train up the ministry. And all truth at that time in the 17th and 18th centuries were thought to be in the Bible. By the 19th century, that changed about halfway through. But in the early 19th century, they still claimed, I've read so many ministers who claimed all truth is in the Bible. As you know, the nation, though, moved west over the Appalachians. And as they moved, they couldn't keep up but with the educating enough ministers. And the Methodists did not have an educated ministry. When the Methodists came to the nation, from England, from the Welsleys over, John and Charles, Wesley, over to the United States, when they came, I think it was 1790 something, there were only, actually, I've got it written down on our handout. It says here, by 1776, there were still under 5,000 Methodists in the nation. But by 1810, there were 130,000. And by 1850, as I said at our last session, they were the largest religion in the nation. How did they get there? How did they do it? Well, it's because they didn't have a trained ministry. They believed that anyone who had felt the Spirit in their life, anyone who stood up at their camp meetings or testimony meetings and said, I felt it. I felt God's power. I felt that my sins are forgiven me. I feel like I'm born again. That was your call, become a minister. And you got $40 a month, you got a horse, you got a Bible, and you got a hymnal. And I have read accounts of many Methodist ministers who would carry with them their portable platform and go from town to town to town to town as they would preach across the nation. And that's how it became the number one faith tradition in our nation, because it moved west. It didn't require a 4-year education in order to become a minister. And so they could multiply and duplicate. And with this thirst for religion all over the nation, those people doing the baptisms were usually those people that received the membership numbers. Lots of different opinions, though, in each different Methodist thought, because if you don't have a trained ministry, at that time, you have an enormous spectrum of what you believe the gospel of Jesus Christ is. This Cane Ridge revival, though, with Barton Stone, became the foundation for what then was to occur on a monthly basis, semi-monthly. We talked a little bit about how many revivals people had during this Second Great Awakening and where they spread to and where was most important. By 1811, so this is when we talked last week about the time when Joseph Sr. had one of his dreams, was right after the 1811 revival up in Vermont. And Joseph Smith's grandpa, Solomon Mack, also was converted at this time. 1/3 of the population attended the summer revival. And the nation is so sparsely populated. Look down here at my numbers on the chart. 1800, we only have 3 million. 1810, 7 million. 1820, 10 million. 1830, 13 million. 1840, 17 million. It's picking up quite quickly. But we have over 2,300,000 approximately attending these national these revivals across the nation. And when I looked at this population number and the numbers of revivals and things, my husband and I both got on 2 different sites on Google looking for population numbers, and everything's a little bit different. They're using the census. They're using da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So the numbers are tweaked a little bit. Don't get too upset if I'm a few hundred off. There was some different, but it's generally speaking that way. The Methodists said we are not totally deprived. That was what they knocked down. The Universalists knocked down the limited atonement. But the Methodists said, no, we can reach out to God. We have the power within ourselves, and God will come to and answer us if we do this. So that was a very important part of this American nation as we grow up with ideas of freedom and liberty and justice for all. That idea was very popular. But these revivals got out of control. I'm sure you've heard about them, and I have just loved reading many of the ministers' reports of them. And the locals who did not like them, who felt that religion should be more pious, more like our Puritan ancestors and the Presbyterian thought, recorded things like this. The groaning and crying out and falling down and screaming. It doesn't quite fit our idea of worship either. It was the shouting that turned into screams and screeches that especially disgusted. The noise was like the roar of Niagara. So you don't have microphones, and yet the people were so enthusiastically involved that it became the noise of Niagara. I got to tell you about where I got all these quotes. 2 professors that I really like, one out of Yale, one out of Harvard, have zoomed in on this period of time. Actually, a third one, Whitney Cross, I mentioned him yesterday, have zoomed in on the Second Great Awakening in upstate New York in the burned over district, and have recorded hundreds and hundreds of people who sought out and received calls from God or sought revelation. Kentucky was another big place where they had a lot of records from this area. And they have journals, and all this is firsthand research. None of this is assumed to be later. These are statements from the people at the time. So during this time period, they are building churches everywhere. And we can't keep up with the missionary zeal. Because religion is the hot topic of the day, it's not how's Pfizer doing on the coronavirus or any other hot topic of your life. I was thinking back in the 50s of who can get a man to the moon first or whatever. But these church buildings could not be kept up. And so most towns would have one building where many people met. And that's what happened in Palmyra with Joseph Smith. There was only one building in town when Joseph lived there. There were many different faiths there that would use the same building. But the 4 buildings on the 4 corners is modern, not literal from that time. But the preachers were 3 times per capita grew during this period of time. And as they moved, this became the place of meeting, not a meeting house. And especially when, I'm going to go back to Joseph's grandmother. She was very pious. Joseph's mother was very pious, but they rarely lived in an area where there's a church building. So they went to these camp meetings, these revivals. And just to remind you from yesterday, the Methodists are on the upsurge. I didn't mean yesterday, I meant the other lecture. The Congregationalists and the Presbyterians are no longer the dominating thought. The reformed thought of tulip, the total depravity and the unlimited election and the limited atonement, those are no longer. They're all being chipped away, and we see this with the Methodists. When the Smith family left upstate New York in 1816, the year without a summer, and left Vermont to come down to New York, they were part of this revival. And we talked about this last week. I just wanted to remind you, 50 towns around Joseph are having this. And the reason why we started doing this research is because people who do not believe in Joseph Smith's first vision came out and attacked, saying there were no revivals in this area. There was no unusual religious excitement. And fortunately, most of the people who did the research on the upstate New York area were not of our faith. They're just good scholars who dove right in, and this is where we get lots of the information that we can now share to say there was a misunderstanding. There really was an enormous opinion on religion. And this statistic alone tells you about it. In 1824, 1/4 of the Presbyterian ministers of the entire nation served in this sparsely populated little area of upstate New York called the Burned Over District. It's burned over because it's a tinder. It's burned over because the ministers are just flying in, and it's going to burn with the Spirit of the Lord. The Spirit of God, like a fire, is burning. So they call it the Burned Over District. And the Presbyterians are coming to regain the Reformed tradition. They are coming to restore civility. No more of this roaring like Niagara. We want people who are reading their scriptures at home and people who are quietly worshiping every Sunday. In fact, do you remember the blue laws? So in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, if you did not go to church 2 times a month, you were fined. And if that means you have to walk 10 miles, you have to walk 10 miles. Because we may not have a church building in your town, but there's one in Boston. So if you're out in Waltham, you walk to Boston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, things like that. And but this surge of trying to regain the Reformed tradition was especially seen in Princeton University. And if you want to have a historical deep dive, go read some of their writings from the ministers there, like Charles Hodge, and really, really fabulous things. So it's not a surprise to me that Joseph said he was somewhat interested in the Methodist faith. Emma was too. But his father did not. After his father was disappointed in the Universalists, he just chose to worship privately. And that caused some contention in the home. There was a time when they moved to upstate New York when Lucy, coming to a new area to make friends, to be part of the community, returns again to the Presbyterian church. And she brings with her Hiram and her daughters. I don't remember if William came or not, but it's in the handout. But the interesting thing is, as they come back to the Presbyterian church, Lucy still is not wanting to be baptized under a certain denomination. And she asks the minister to baptize her without the denomination, just to be baptized to fulfill the biblical commandment. They arrived in 1816, but they don't have a property yet. They all go out and work as day laborers and earn enough money as they can. And 2 years from the time, this is Lucy speaking, 2 years from the time they entered Palmyra, we were able to settle ourselves upon our own land in a snug, that's the key word, comfortable though humble habitation built neatly furnished by our own industry. So from 1818 to 1825, they all squeeze in to this lovely log cabin that actually was Hiram's. Hiram was building it for his family. He's not married yet, but this was going to be his home. They're all living there. And then in 1825, they have their new framed house that they move into, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this log cabin that they move into is where Joseph was living at the time of the first vision and Moroni's visions. And actually, I believe he is there also at the end of the time of the organization of the church. They go back there. But Hiram had arranged to purchase 80 of the acres, and then the rest of the family came. And when Jerusha and Hiram are married, this is where she comes to in November of 26 at their wedding. They're in there while the rest of the family is just down the street, or, well, it would say street. It's on the same 100 acres, just down, living there. But when they got there, they began clearing the land. It says they bought a 100-acre forest in Lucy's memoirs. They cut down hundreds, if not thousands, of trees that was not the maple trees. They left up their maples, and then they planted about 1,500 more maples. But they used this wood to sell as cordwood. They burned it to make potash. They sold maple sugar. That became their main family industry. And Joseph Sr. was actually a cooper. And if I remember right, I think he was a water cooper, which means not only do you just build the barrel, but your barrels are so tight that you can pour water in and it's not going to leak. So they're the most refined ones. But he worked as so many things. He even worked as a school teacher. Joseph Sr. was extremely Renaissance kind of a man. They made black ash baskets out of some of the materials there on their farm. Lucy, I guess, was a really good artist, and she would paint oilcloths and sell them at these community gatherings, either the social gatherings like 4th of July or else the revivals. And they also made birchwood brooms and would sell them as peddlers in the neighborhood. They made a root beer. Now, in a couple of accounts, it just says beer. And I assume that it could have been both. I have no idea, because, of course, your water isn't always pure, and you add a little alcohol just at the time, like at the time of the Lord, but it's diluted down. The time of the Lord, they usually diluted it 10 parts water, 1 part wine. And here, in one account, it says they're making root beer. In another account, they said they would go to the revivals and sell their beer and cakes. And Joseph was usually the little boy, the peddler, who'd be out doing that in the community, going to all these revivals. They also grew corn and wheat. They had a garden. They had an apple orchard and grew lots of other trees there. But their main crop is maples. And when I lived in that area of the world and in Wisconsin, I tapped our maple trees. And it is so much work. I tell you, it's a nightmare to try to make this stuff. I now know why real maple syrup is so expensive. It takes 30,000 gallons of maple syrup to make 1,000 pounds of maple sugar. And that's what they did. That's exactly what they did. They plant these maple trees, and then their spring starts with, as soon as the thaw comes, they start tapping the trees. You catch the bucket and you pour it in, and you just are constantly busy boiling this stuff down until it turns into maple syrup and then maple sugar, laitière in French. And it was their family's main source of income. As Palmyra grew, it's only 25 years old as a city. So at first they don't have any schools, they don't have any churches, they're just building homes. And then you add the schools, and then you add the one church. But in 1816, when Joseph's family and Lucy Mack arrive, they noticed in this community that they have days of public doings. And that's where they began peddling their root beer and cakes. And in all the records that I've read from the Methodist ministers and the people who would have their sermons recorded, like Charles Finney, they all talk about, Charles Finney, I think, is one of the greatest revivalists. If you want to just read one, dive into Charles Finney's autobiography or many of his other books. I also love his book on his revivals. But they refer to the Spirit of the Lord by the word power. But they don't use it like we would, because I would say the power of God is manifest through the gifts of the Spirit, through the fruits of the Spirit, through the priesthood. Well, I guess everything's the priesthood then, isn't it? Because it's the power of God on earth. But they use power for a different kind of words. And we'll see some of that in quotes like this. Joseph told, so this is someone that Joseph in 1844 told him about his first vision there in Nauvoo, and he recorded it while Joseph was still alive as a secondhand account of the first vision. Brother Joseph told us the first call he had to revival meetings, his mother, brother, and sister got religion. And he wanted to get religion. This is just the word that everybody used. Just go through and read Peter Cartwright's autobiography, and it's all like this. We want to get religion. And he wanted to feel and shout like the rest, but he could feel nothing. They had that row up in front. This was one of Charles Finney's idea, to put some benches down right up at the front for those people that were seeking forgiveness, so they could feel the full power that came out of these ministers who were trained and schooled in amplifying their voice, and somehow they were able to speak at such a range, like an opera singer that could fill the whole hall. And they sought the power, but the power came in such interesting ways. I think they missed the part in Elijah about the still small voice from 1 Kings. Here's another one from Peter Cartwright. He's the minister, the Methodist that I told you about. On a Saturday evening of said meeting, I went with weeping multitudes and bowed before the stand and earnestly prayed for mercy. And in the midst of that solemn struggle of soul, an impression was made on my mind, as though a voice said to me, "Thy sins are all forgiven thee." Divine light flashed all around me. Unspeakable joy sprung up in my soul. I rose to my feet, opened my eyes, and it really seemed as if I was in heaven. The trees, the leaves on them, and everything seemed, and I really thought they were praising God. My mother raised the shout. My Christian friends crowded around me and joined in praising God. So Peter Cartwright was seeking religion from age 16, 17 or something, and he finally has this experience. It sounds to me like he goes into complete depression. I think he was an illegitimate child, and I think he had some extramarital relationships before he was married, and it really put him in terrible depression. But he is a sincere seeker and becomes a fabulous minister, and also a critic of Joseph Smith. They overlap several times, and I'll share with you more as we go along. But on this spectrum of American thought, you have an understanding of Revelation that goes from one extreme, that it is only given in the New Testament to apostles, and the only place you can feel the Spirit is while reading the New Testament about what the apostles did, to the other extreme, where we have people like the Methodists. I'm using here as my example of Peter Cartwright and Charles Finney, who was a Congregationalist, but he did not follow the Reformed traditions. He had never been educated in a religious schooling to the sense of believing it. He always said, I don't interpret my Bible that way. I'm going to interpret it my own way, and that's why I put him in the Congregationalist. But Charles Finney is a man of God. These were real men of God. And occasionally they got out of control. But I feel that most of these people were searching for truth, and they were blinded in many ways. Hence, they attacked Joseph because Satan was trying to make enemies. But much of these people's work was divinely inspired. And then, of course, because they didn't understand everything, they went astray. But this back and forth, almost like a teeter-totter, you have the nations or your communities seeking the Spirit, reaching out, no passive religiosity. Everything is extremely active. And then you have the Puritans come in and say, no, you need to wait for God's interaction. And if you receive it, that means you're one of the elect. And if you don't, it means you're damned. But you don't seek it. You know, Joseph grew up in this environment, and he's hearing the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Baptists and the Congregationalists arguing as he goes to peddle the pies and the cakes, We find many ministers of this time who had favorite sermons that they would just repeat in different locations. There was a reverend from the Presbyterian Church named Reverend Jesse Townsend who used James 1:5 as one of his favorite scriptures to go to. And George Lane was a Methodist minister who also spoke in an area not too far from Joseph's home that spoke on James 1:5. We also know that Joseph's family is reading from the Bible night and morning for his entire life. So we don't know exactly where and when he received this vision. This motivation to study James 1:5. But we all probably have memorized, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, which giveth to all men liberally, and it upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. And that's what focused Joseph. as we look at his stories, and I think this one's actually in the 1832 account, but I'm not remembering exactly where I read this one. It says he left his axe in the area he wanted to come back and pray. It says that, in his canonized version of the 1838 account that we have in the Pro Great Price, it says this scripture just filled him, and he prepared and planned. And somewhere in his maple orchard, probably, and if it's in the spring, they're probably still preparing the maple syrup. And he has his axe out either to cut wood to make the fires, which probably would only be dead wood, or to actually cut little holes in your maple tree so that the sap would run with the next frost. But he picks out the spot where he wants to go and leaves his axe there. And this was unusual for the family. We have an account by one of the members that said he was always so meticulous about his little axe. He took great care of it, and he always polished it and sharpened it as soon as he finished using it and got it home that night. So this was an unusual situation for him to leave it out overnight to make sure he could go to a place where he felt comfortable. You have this house that is, actually, I didn't want that one. I don't know where my next one is. You have a house that has the foundational stones, about 20 by 30, with 11 family members living there. Many people in the same bed. And I don't know if you remember, but when we first read that quote, Lucy said that their furniture was of their own making. Now, yes, Alvin was a great craftsman, but at this point, Alvin is spending as much time as he can helping the family build a house, he doesn't start building the house now, but he's starting this maple sugar portion. I don't know if their furniture would have been beautiful. I think if Alvin had been making any furniture, it wouldn't be in their home. The beautiful stuff. If he can get good money for it, I think he would be selling it to help pay for the mortgage on this property. There's been a lot of research lately on when did this happen. And having the internet is such a blessing to look at things like the farmers' almanacs, to decide when was it raining, when was it snowing, what day of the weeks were they, what day of the week did they not work, starting from way before dawn and way after dusk. It would have been a Sunday. So most people who have looked at these almanacs and come up with these ideas have it way earlier than I think. When I lived there, I didn't think it was spring until the end of May and early June. But I was a foreigner coming from California to the east. So for me, springtime is when it gets warm, not when it thaws during the daytime and then freezes at night. So it might have been March 26th. It might have been other days. But many people have been doing this research now, and that's fun to go read, see some of these things online of the possibilities of different dates when the weather would have been right, when it was a clear spring morning. And I feel that we need an artist to give Joseph a hat and gloves and muffler. I mean, it is cold, and most of our artists have him like they have here in a shirt material. But this area of the world is hard to live in, and you develop personality, and you develop characteristics that come from hard work. And I believe we see this in Joseph. The first vision is a story that speaks of truth, but it also is an experience that directly attested to the 3 points that were most regularly spoken of in the early second grade awakening. Revelation, Trinity, and the depravity of man. All three of those, it's like a bowling pins, and you just get a strike. Joseph's first vision, all of the pins are down. The dominoes are knocked down. Joseph is able to immediately see what revelation is and how we can access God. I have to tell you a funny story. I was writing a paper in graduate school. I studied with the Catholics for my doctorate, and I was at Marquette University. It's the largest Jesuit school, divinity school in the nation. And I prepared this 24-page on Revelation in the 18th century. And after I presented it to my class, all the classmates raised their hand and said, how do you define revelation? I said, inspiration from God, divine insight. How do you define revelation? One person said, revelation is another word for Jesus Christ. Another person said, revelation means the Holy Scriptures. Another person said, and they went on and on and on. It was a completely different view of what revelation was. So even though we use the same vocabulary, it's really helpful when we are talking not only to members of our church, but to members of different faiths, to make sure that our vocabulary has the same definition. But this first vision answered so many more questions of Joseph's than just what church to join. We have 8 first-hand accounts written by Joseph, 5 second-hand accounts. And here's that quote from John W. Welch. They have a high degree of independence and cooperation among the accounts. I also see that some of the accounts are shorter and abbreviated. And so I'm going to focus on the long, full accounts, 32, 35, 39, and 42. These personal accounts given by Joseph was dictated to the prophet and then written by Frederick G. Williams between 1832 in the summer, sometime until the end of November. Then in 1835, on November 9th, in Kirtland, Joseph told a visitor, Robert Matthias, about his first vision. And I think this is the one who was his Hebrew teacher, if I'm remembering the right people. In 1835, Frederick G. Williams re-recorded Joseph's 1835 account with a few alterations and changed the first person to third person. So that's one of the accounts we have, but I'm not going to touch on that one today because it's basically just a rewriting in first to second person. November 14th, 1835, Joseph summarized in a conversation that referred to the first visitation of angels. And it's interesting who he talked about initially and early on. This was a sacred event, and he does not talk about it. It wasn't that his mother, when he comes in, says, Joseph, are you all right? And he says, I know for myself that Presbyterian is not right. It's not that he then goes on to tell her, like I thought I had understood from my good primary teacher. It's that he, like Mary of Nazareth, holds these things in his heart for a long time. And then when he refers to it, sometimes he's more open than others. But the audience matters. And the ability to communicate things is different with who you're speaking to. 1838. This was the account that Joseph dictated to James Mulholland that we now have canonized. And that's the one that most of us try to memorize to have it in our mind. 1842, Joseph prepared a history for John Wentworth. He was the editor in Chicago, of the Chicago Democrat newspaper, but he was actually asking for it in New Hampshire, the history of New Hampshire, of George Boschloss, but it was never recorded in there. It just only recorded in the Chicago Democrat. And then there was another request shortly thereafter for this American Religions book that was being published. And so Joseph recorded much of what he had just done for the Chicago Democrat and gave it to Mr. Roop. But I have to tell you, the newspapers are filled with religion. The reason why these newspapers are asking is because by 1844, Joseph was a hot topic. I just scanned through on the internet the precursor of the New York Times, the New York City Inquirer or something like this. And I just scanned through, starting in about 1832, 1840, 1844. By the time we get to 1844, almost every issue has something on the Mormonites, the Golden Bible, or Joseph Smith. It was just fascinating. And there, by that time, they're clear out in Nauvoo. And yet it was a very hot topic. Now, the second-hand accounts who heard Joseph during his lifetime, they recorded it. It has to be recorded before Joseph dies in 1844. 1840, Orson Pratt publishes a missionary pamphlet in the British Isles that Joseph then used later. So we assume that Joseph agreed with what he wrote. In 1842, Orson Hyde. Remember, Orson Hyde's the one who dedicated the land of Israel for the return of the Jews and for the gathering of Israel. And he's also the one who says he has who some people believed. I assume he does. I mean, he said he has the whole Bible memorized. He was fluent in many languages too. Orson Hyde publishes his missionary pamphlet in Germany, which included a retelling of the Book of Mormon, of the first vision. And then Levi Richards in 43 recorded in his diary on the day that Joseph told him about the first vision. So that one, the timing is right. In 43 also, David White visited Nauvoo as an editor for one of the Pittsburgh newspapers called the Weekly Gazette, and the prophet met with him and told him about his first vision. So by 43, he's talking about it. He's telling many people. He's already written it several times by now, and it is part of the sacred history that can be shared. And that's, I believe, how Luke found out of Mary's birth, because Luke was living near where Mary lived, according as you look up all the Pauline information on where Paul and Luke are going on their journeys, and they go to Ephesus where Mary was living with John the Beloved. Anyway, sorry for the biblical setback there. Back to 1843. It was reprinted. That same article was reprinted on September 23rd in the New York Spectacular or something. Spectator, sorry. And then it was as a new text had been rephrased and paraphrased at times. But in 1844 is when we get Alexander Niebuhr's Joseph's Hebrew and German tutor in Nauvoo. Okay, I was mistaken. I thought that other guy was, but it's Alexander Niebuhr. I made a little. Well, no, we got to start here. This is Joseph's handwriting. This is the only account that we have in his penmanship, and you can see some of them. But at the same time, the same year, I mean, that Joseph is writing out his journal record of this, is when he describes his inability to communicate with his turkey quill. And remember what his wife says about his ability to write a letter, and he can't even say a coherent sentence, and he uses too many words. Remember all those stories from Emma. But this is when Joseph said, 1832 is when he said that the English language, or trying to write, was a crooked, broken, scattered, and imperfect language. And so as we read his first account of this, remember there's no whiteout. There's no backspacing. And it's with a quill. And if you haven't taken time to sit down and write out the Joseph Smith story with a quill, you should try it. Or have someone dictate one of the revelations out loud from the Doctrine and Covenants and write it. It is amazingly laborious. And I've even practiced. But let's read some of this. It's so beautiful. He's just expressing it on paper for the first time, we assume, since it's the first one we can find. And he is just so humble. And the whole thing is remembering back to being this 14-year-old boy who wanted a forgiveness of his sins. And he was seeking what everyone in the community was seeking. An experience where you could feel the Spirit. In order to be baptized in the Presbyterian Church, you have to got to document and yet tell your minister about your spiritual experience, about a spiritual experience. The same thing with a Methodist. If you want to say that you want to be a Methodist minister, all you have to do is say, here's the way I felt the Spirit. And they have to record it. But to be a Presbyterian, you have to be living all the commandments, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite difficult. Sort of like our temple recommend questions. But here he starts out. And you can see some of the words here where I've put the arrows in so you can follow his notes. But the 1832 account begins. And I know it's hard to listen to somebody read something, but when I was taking my first Shakespeare class, the way I could understand it the best is if I listened to the Shakespeare and read it at the same time. So if you want to pull out my handout on this, these are on all there, all written out in full, and it might be able to sink in. At the age of about 12, my mind became somewhat seriously impressed with regard to the all-important concerns of the welfare of my immortal soul, which led me to searching the Scriptures, believing as I was taught that they contained the Word of God, and thus applied myself to them. See, this is his good parents. This is what they did every night and every morning. He was taught that the Scriptures contain the answers, and I believe they do. You get on your knees to ask God, and then you open up your Scriptures to find your answers. My intimate acquaintance with those different denominations led me to marvel exceedingly, Now, the reason why it's intimate is, remember, he's the boy who's peddling the cakes and the root beer. I discovered that they did not adorn their professions by the holy walk and godly conversation agreeable to that I found pertaining to the sacred deplority. This was my grief to my soul. Now, another reason why I knew about it is he joined in with the local boys in the community, and sometimes they'd go over to the printing office and they formed themselves a debate club, and they would debate religion going back and forth. Thus, from the age of 12 to 15, I pondered many things in my heart concerning the situation of the world of mankind, and the contentions and divisions and the wickedness and the abominations of the darkness which pervaded the minds of mankind. My mind became exceedingly distressed, for I became convicted of my sins. I got to tell you another little story. I got a phone call during the election. Someone asked me, we're just trying to find out what you think the worst problems are in Silicon Valley. I live in Silicon Valley, in the Bay Area, just south of San Francisco, north of San Jose. And they begin reciting this long list of water and energy and pollution and freeways. I said, nope. They said, well, what do you think the worst problem is? I said, sin. He said, what? I said, sin, S-I-N. Our worst problem is sin. He said, you've got to be kidding me. And I said, oh, no, it really is. It wasn't on his list. Joseph continues on. I was convicted of my sins, and by searching the scriptures, I found that mankind did not come unto the Lord, but that they had apostatized from the true and living faith, and that there was no society or denomination that was built upon the gospel of Jesus Christ as recorded in the New Testament. I felt to mourn for my own sins. That is the approach we need to take to the sacrament every week. And for the sins of the world. For I learned in the scriptures that God was the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that he was no respecter of persons. I'm going to skip down a little bit. I looked upon the sun and the glorious luminary of the earth, and also the moon and the rolling majesties through the heavens, and also the stars shining in the courses, and the earth upon which I stood, and the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the heaven. See, he's out in nature every day, and he sees its beauty, and he feels God's spirit because he's out in nature. I believe that this is the same time period that the transcendentalists are coming in to Boston, or actually, I think they're over by Lexington, is where you get most of our transcendentalists at this point in 1820. But they believe that God is in nature. Remember that beautiful Elizabeth Browning, every bush is a fire, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries. I messed it up. I didn't do a very good job, but that's the transcendentalist. That's what he's talking about. Joseph is a transcendentalist more than he is an enlightened, fitting in the mentality of an enlightenment person. He sees this beauty and power and intelligence in governing the things which were so exceedingly great and marvelous, even in the likeness of God who created them. I'm skipping. I cried unto the Lord for mercy, for there was none else to whom I could go to obtain mercy. And the Lord heard my cry in the wilderness. And while in the attitude of calling upon the Lord, in my 16th year of age, a pillar of light upon the brightness of the sun at noonday came down from above and rested upon me. Now, some people say, some records account later that he was in his 15th year. And you'd think, don't you know what year it is? And I say, those of you that question this kind of, think that this is a hard question, just need to try to remember back to what day of the week your most greatest spiritual experience happened when you were 14 or 15 or 16. Or can you remember even, just play the memory game. What did you eat last week? What did you wear to General Conference this year when we were at home, watching it online? You know, things like that. Your memory doesn't always keep all the details face, but many of them are the same, and many are consistent. He goes on and he says, the brightness, there's a pillar of light above the noonday, and it came down from above and rested upon me, and I was filled with the Spirit of God, and the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord, and he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. Go thy way and walk in my statutes and keep my commandments. Behold, I am the Lord of glory. Some people have denounced this account because the Father is not mentioned. But he can be mentioned. Joseph is talking about seeking forgiveness, seeking order, And that's what he's trying to get to. And he says, the heavens were opened unto me, and the Lord said to me, and then he quotes this part. So I do not see this as a hard question because there is so much consistency, and it's better if there's a little bit of variation. Those wonderful scholars who study different ideas realize that the differences help. The differences make it more accurate if they're within a certain realm of possibility. If something is fraudulent, it's usually repeated word for word. You've got it memorized, you recite it over and over. I was going to read all these accounts, but for the sake of time, I think I better just leave that to you. But please take the time to get on Joseph Smith Papers Project and see the handwriting of these different people and feel some of these beautiful innuendos. And then if there's an artist out there, please let's get some artwork for the different accounts. This one I just love. This is the one that says everything looks like it's on fire. And then he crosses out fire and says light. One time he says, I think the leaves, the whole forest is going to burn up. And remember when he's talking about the devil, one of the accounts, he says that he heard the steps behind him. And one of the movie producers has tried to add that in. But I just feel like we do a disservice if we think the whole story is in one account, just like with the Gospels. And in the 1838 account, we know well from the first, we hear of the Father and the Son coming. But in another account, he says they did not come down at the same time. They come down separately, one first and then the other. So we just get little details like that. This one is, look at this exquisite penmanship. Oh, isn't that just amazing? This one is the 1842 in response to the Wentworth editor of the Chicago Democrat. And this one is, I think, the most interesting of all, and not the most interesting of all. I like the first one the best, the 1832, but it has the most interesting details that I don't hear elsewhere. He went into the wood to pray, knelt himself down. His tongue was closed, cleaved to the roof, and he could not utter a word. I've tried to use the same spelling from the Joseph Smith translation, obviously, the Joseph Smith Papers, obviously. He could not utter a word, but he felt easier after a while. So he doesn't say, he didn't include that detail, that he pled to the Lord to release this. But again, this is a second-hand account. I saw fire towards heaven come near and nearer, and saw a personage in the fire, light complexion, blue eyes, piece of white cloth drawn over his shoulder, and his right arm was bare. I mean, it's sounding like the Moroni story, isn't it? Except I don't know about the eyes. I've always pictured the Lord with red hair. And I hope those of you with chocolate chip eyes and chocolate chip hair and beautiful rainbow colored skin opportunities see the Lord in that same color as well. I don't know if this wonderful German saw him in his own eyes or if that was Joseph's account of it. He continues on. His white cloth was drawn over his shoulder and his right arm was bare. After a while, another person came to the side of the first, and Mr. Smith then asked, must I join the Methodist Church? No, they are not my people. But many of them are. But their theories and their theology wasn't the full truth. But there are many good people in many faiths. Okay, back from my commercial, back to the text. All have gone astray. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Meaning the theology or the doctrines or the creeds are not correct. But this is my beloved Son. Hearken to him. The fire drew near, rested upon the tree, and enveloped him. So it is just fascinating. That book that I mentioned at the very beginning, my favorite book on this subject, Opening the Windows of Heaven, is filled with charts like this. There are many, many, many charts, and I just reduced them and synthesized them in a systematic way so that they could fit on one screen. Did Joseph express that there was a concern for his soul, for forgiveness of his sins, that he was confused about the religions of the day, that he was drawn there because the way the scriptures burned in his heart from the Epistle of James, chapter 1, verse 5, that the answer came to prayer, that he asked about other churches, and that there was an evil power and an evil spirit present to stop his tongue, to stop his questioning. He prayed for help, and that's when the fire and the light appeared. The light was brighter than the sun. There were two personages. They were identical. He was told that his sins were forgiven. It was a time of glory. He was told that all of the churches had adopted false teachings, but that the gospel was going to be promised, that the gospel of Jesus Christ was going to be restored, and that Joseph felt joy and peace and calmness and love. Oh, I wish I would have read that one on one of them. It's absolutely, let me just go back to this one from 1832. My soul was filled with love. For many days I could rejoice with great joy. The Lord was with me, but I could not find none that would believe the heavenly vision. Now that suggests he did tell more than just the one minister, doesn't it? Nevertheless, I pondered these things in my heart. And that goes back to where I said he didn't tell too many people. You don't have to be rejected very often. And remember, he comes from the background of 3 years of agonizing pain without even an aspirin to dull it. Anyway, I just think it's all fascinating to look at this psychological background. So perhaps his parents did not know. And if they did not know right away, this may be why, in Lucy Mack's account, remembering back, sometimes she mixes up Joseph's first vision and Moroni information. She says that Joseph asked Moroni what church to join. But we'll talk about that next week when we get to Moroni's visitations. I feel like I've just touched on one little leaf from a twig off the maple grove behind Joseph Smith's log cabin. And as we zoom out and zoom in, there is so much richness in this account. But as we do so, I hope as we seek to ask the same hard questions that Joseph Smith asked, we can do it with that same attitude of humility and meekness and faith and hope. And then the hard questions become times of revelation for you and for me and for Joseph the prophet and even our Savior, who went out to pray on his own regularly. It says he went away from the crowds to seek revelation. And for me, the first vision is in and of itself a beautiful story, but it's also a magnetic, empowering, enabling, motivating force that encourages me to go to my Lord in prayer. And instead of expecting a vision like I did when I was a child, for the Lord to answer me in vision, I receive the still small voice. Visions come, as we'll talk about in 3 more sessions on the witnesses, to those who, well, we'll talk about then. I feel very strongly that if we are going in the right direction, the Lord sends us the still small voice and encourages us in that direction. And I leave this with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.